We are fortunate to have with us today John Carlin, an award-winning journalist, an author, and a leading figure in the world, a thought leader. John, welcome.
It's a pleasure to be here, John. Pleasure to be here.
Well, the honor is ours. Your book, Playing the Enemy, Nelson Mandela and the Game That Made a Nation, was the basis for the 2009 film Invictus. Now, that was based on your own experience. The book was based living in South Africa for several years, during which time you spent a lot of time with Mandela, and it's the basis of envy of many of us. And so, but you were good enough to record those experiences, and not only write that book, but there was also another book in 2008, the same year that you wrote the book, Knowing Mandela. And so tonight we feel particularly honored to have you as we're approaching the UN Nelson Mandela Day, International Day, which is a global call to action that celebrates the idea that each person has the ability and the power to change the world for the better. So, John, I want to start off by recalling one of my books that I like here. In addition to yours, it doesn't come as close to yours as I would like, but there is a book called Let Africa Lead. It was written in 2006 by somebody you may know, Ruel Khoza. And Ruel Khoza, in the book, he says, amongst other things, that we all know that the greatest leader of this era lives in this country, he says, meaning South Africa. Yet, he's written no book on leadership, and he's developed no manual on leadership, because he is that book. And in the typical African idiom, you have to come close to somebody to see who that person is. And so you've had that privilege, and so and we want to have a discussion with you tonight about what you saw. And at the Ubuntu Academy, Leaders Academy, we have extracted 5 principles or 5 pillars. The first of which is self-knowledge. And so I wondered if you can talk to us about what you saw in Mandela, that this deep understanding of who he was, and not only a deep understanding, but the fact is that a realization that I am because we are, and that we are not separate from our community. I know that self-knowledge lies at the heart of Ubuntu, and I wondered if you can tell us a bit about what you saw in Nelson Mandela as a man that knew himself.
Well, thank you very much, John. First of all, the concept of I am as we are is very much incarnated in Mandela. See, the word self-knowledge applied to Mandela is very difficult to separate from his knowledge of his people generally in the time in which he lived. So in a way, the word self there is almost too limiting. You know, you're talking about him alone. Self means one person. And I think that Mandela was just so much the expression, the incarnation of his people, that you've got to somehow broaden the definition of the word self, which in turn, of course, gets us very nicely to the idea of Ubuntu, of I am as we are. Because you could say just to play devil's advocate for a moment, that self-knowledge in terms of the private sphere of his private life, maybe he wasn't so strong on that. You know, as you know very well, his private life, excuse me, you know, with his second wife, Winnie Mandela, a lot of problems with his children. You know, there he was not so adept at managing things in the way that he would have liked, and things rather slipped out of his control. So I think that where Mandela's self-knowledge resides is in his status as a political leader, as the vehicle to express the desires and aspirations of his people. And I think having self-knowledge implies having a sense of one's limitations, of how far you can go in the real world. You know, they say politics is the art of the possible. And Mandela wasn't a dreamer. Well, he maybe was before he went into prison. You know, he had this notion that he was going to come to power through, like they used to say, the Castro way, as in Cuba, you know, through force of arms. And, you know, he went to prison, and prison was a tremendously valuable experience, however painful it was for him, in terms of within that tiny cell, within those four walls of his tiny cell, acquiring a better sense of the limitations of the possible. So if you like, a greater degree of self-knowledge in terms of himself as a political leader. And he understood that the notion that they were going to sort of storm the citadel of Pretoria, as I say, you know, like Fidel Castro did in Cuba, wasn't going to be the way to work. If you wanted really to, A, succeed in getting rid of apartheid, B, establishing a democracy, and C, consolidating a democracy without that democracy being vulnerable to a counter-revolution, if you like, by the right wing, you had to operate within certain parameters. And he was quite brilliant at judging that. You know, you said yourself a moment ago, John, that he didn't write the manual in leadership because he himself was the manual.
Yeah.
And, you know, I think that there was almost something instinctive about Mandela, almost a genius about him. You know, in the same way that Lionel Messi is a brilliant football player, or Mozart was a great composer of music, Mandela was a great natural political leader. He just had the gift. He was in tune with the times. He could anticipate things. He had a vision that went way beyond just a question of being intelligent or clever or erudite. It goes way beyond that. It's a much deeper knowledge, which, yes, if we like, we can call self-knowledge.
Yes, thank you. That's very powerful. I to try and rephrase it in my own words, what you were pointing out is that self-knowledge is not an expression of an individualistic existence, but a recognition that we are interconnected and dependent with each other. And therefore, self-knowledge has fundamentally to do with the value of the collective according to a community-based understanding of self. It's not an individualistic understanding of self. So, yeah. So thank you for helping us understand that in a deeper way. I just want to end by saying, I think Nelson Mandela, I'm sure you will agree, says that as a person, he came into the world as we all are, but he recognized very readily that he was not complete because others complete him. And so his friends, his Ravonia trialist, his family, the country, the world is completing him. So he would be the one.
Could I interrupt you 1 minute, John? Excuse me. Yeah. I think that's a very important point. And I just want to just say something just to support what you just said. Namely, that even though Mandela was born a black man in a deeply unjust system where all the odds were stacked against black people generally, nevertheless, he did belong to a privileged sector of that society. And he could have got it on his own and done fine. You know, he went to university, he was a lawyer, he had his own legal practice. You know, Tambo and Mandela, him and Oliver Tambo. I mean, he could have just said, you know, why am I going to squander this relative privilege that I have, even if I'm a black man in South Africa? He was going to be able to live pretty well, make decent money. You know, he could do fine for himself. So he took the decision, the big, huge decision, to sacrifice what could have been, like I say, a perfectly comfortable life within the, you know, terrible indignity of apartheid. But materially, he could have lived well enough. And he chose not to. He decided to become precisely at one with his people and, you know, flow like a river with them rather than sit on the edge of the river watching the currents flow past.
Yes. It was a choice. Yes.
Yeah, he made a choice. He made a choice.
Yeah. Yeah. It wasn't forced on him. If it was forced on him, it's from the power inside.
Yeah.
And the inspiration that came with that.
Yeah, no,
Thank
the
you, John.
point is,
Can we?
He had a choice.
Yeah.
That's the point. He had a choice.
Yes, and thank you for that. I wonder if I can move on to another pillar, and that is self-confidence. Now, you know, I had the privilege of seeing him once or twice, and close by, around the same table. But that I can't count that as knowing Mandela like you did. But the little bit that I saw of him was enough for me to understand that by self-confidence, he understood that to mean confident without being arrogant. That he was bold, but not arrogant, although he could have been at times. And I think self-confidence within the context of Ubuntu has got to do with, it's a statement of value, right? A statement of value. And humility, on the other hand, has to do with a non-overestimation of oneself. Self-confidence has got to do with a non-underestimation of oneself. And as you said, he had the gift of bringing those two things together in a perfect blend of humanity. Your view?
Well, look, self-confidence, Mandela's self-confidence was off the charts. It's a whole new sort of dimension of self-confidence. Just kind of, it's just stratospheric, you know, it's up there and with the planets, with the stars. He had an immense self-confidence. You know, he had this word that we use, charisma, and charisma means massive self-confidence. Charisma means something that few people have. Mandela was someone that could go into a room with, I don't know, 50 people that he'd never seen before, and he just knew that he was going to be liked. You know, he didn't have insecurities of that social kind at all. Now, where does that self-confidence comes from? Well, obviously, partly, you know, we all have our different temperaments and we all have our different circumstances of our lives. And maybe if you endured some terrible slight when you were 14 years old, it could mark you for life and you're going to be insecure. You know, Mandela, I think, had something in his upbringing and maybe even in his genetic code that gave him a self-confidence. But I think an important point in terms of explaining his self-confidence is that I think the secret of Mandela's self-confidence, and from that, his ability to persuade, which is the essential gift of a successful politician or political leader in any circumstances, comes from his integrity. And I think integrity is an extremely important word generally. Integrity, I think, is possibly one, you know, the quality most to be valued in people, but in particular in a leader like Mandela. And what I mean by that is that there was an extraordinary diamond hard coherence between the values that Mandela preached in public and his behavior in private. So often you hear about political leaders who will spout forth about equality and what have you, but then they treat, I don't know, their chauffeur or the waiter at the restaurant or whatever horribly, in a sort of contemptuous fashion. Mandela was the precise opposite. Mandela was a person, maybe his core message was respect everybody equally. And Mandela would be equally respectful in the presence of the Queen of England or the President of the United States as he would be with, the flight attendant on the plane or the person who, washed the dishes in his home or whatever. There was and that's what I call integrity, that diamond hard integrity. You can't see the cracks. There is no hypocrisy. And I think if you behave in that way in life generally, then that diamond hard integrity can translate into something like a diamond hard self-confidence. I think it's people who lack self-confidence and who are arrogant, as you say, it's a very important distinction. If you're arrogant, I think that the flip side of arrogant is insecurity. If you're arrogant, if you're showing off how potent, how distinguished you are, almost certainly show me an arrogant person and I will show you someone who's got some kind of insecurities and doubts about themselves and moral fragilities. And Mandela didn't have that. He was the last word in self-confidence.
Yes. John, you may agree with me that self-confidence also has to do with courage and focus. And even in the light of criticism, you have enough confidence in yourself and where you're going to keep you on the journey that you are pursuing. And he continued working in the interest of other people. And it wasn't on a personal mission. That's really what I would say. His confidence didn't lead him onto a personal mission, but going on a mission in the interest of the community. And I'm sure you would agree with that. I can just, on another matter, contrasting his self-confidence with his self-effacing manner. And that is, the one time I did sit with him at dinner, it was at a function, and he then was called up onto the stage, and the children were singing, and he went behind them and he danced like he normally does. And then when they stopped singing, the program director said, "You can now go forward." He says, "No, I can't." He says, "Why not?" He said, "You haven't told the people who I am. You can't assume that people know who I am." Yeah. So I just like that about
well,
he had a blend. Yeah.
If I could just cut in there on a minute. I mean, I think that in a way is related as much to the first pillar we talked about, self-knowledge, in the sense that once Mandela came out of prison and he became this, huge, incredibly famous worldwide personality, he was aware of the fact that he could intimidate people, that people might not behave naturally in his company. And so he had this reflex, which he showed with you, that anecdote you're showing. He had this reflex to kind of make fun of himself, to bring himself down. And it was kind of a way of telling the people he was with, be it just one individual or be it a group, look, you know what? I'm just another regular guy. I happen to have done all these things, and I'm Nelson Mandela. But actually, don't take me too damn seriously. And so by making a little joke, you kind of lighten the mood, and the people around you feel less intimidated. The tension goes down, and you prepare the environment, the atmosphere, for a more easy communication.
Yes. Thank you. John, can we move on to the third one? And that's resilience. I'm sure you can help us understand where resilience came from, because resilience has got to do with the ability to work through pain. And when you encounter obstacles, not to give up. And you can only really do that if the goals that you set are congruent with the things that you value most. And in Nelson Mandela, it was clear that that's the basis of, and the inspiration of his resilience. Would you agree?
Yes, completely. I think, let's just think of a really basic form of resilience. When you go for a long run, if you do
Yeah.
a marathon or something, you need resilience at the most basic sort of physical level. And what is it
Yes.
that keeps you going through the pain barrier is your conviction in the value of the objective of making it to the tape, to the end of the race. And Mandela had that as a sort of resilience, I think, as an inborn quality, quite aside from politics, because talking of running, when he was a younger man, before he went to prison, he was a boxer. And he'd go running every day from his house in Soweto to the gym, and he'd get up at about 3:30 or 4 in the morning to go running. So he had a sort of physical resilience right there. And then, of course, the real test of his resilience was in prison. You're condemned to a life sentence, and then you get sent down to this island off the Cape Town coast, and you're told basically the key's been thrown away and you're going to be here till you die. Now, keep on going despite that, and to have already, very soon after he entered prison, started to prepare the terrain for the day when he believed he would come out, and he would, not this time by force of arms, but through dialogue, through negotiation, end apartheid and establish democracy. To have that faith is the critical prerequisite, which is exactly the point you just made, John, the critical prerequisite to then have that resilience, that endurance, that capacity to keep going, your absolute conviction that the goal to which you strive is a goal of immense value, so much value that you're going to, persist in it, come what may.
Yes. There were those that went to prison with him. I don't mean the Rivonia trialists, but there were others during the same period who gave up, and I can't blame them. I wouldn't have been able to withstand some of the atrocities that were perpetrated there. But we do live in a low commitment world. And, resilience has got to do with a deep sense of commitment of where you want to go. And it's the one thing that I really admire about Madiba.
No, that's right. And the thing is, we're going through these pillars individually, but one feeds off the other: self-knowledge, self-confidence, resilience. They're all, bound together. You can't really, we're separating them, and it's useful as an exercise, but in a way, if you don't have them all, then you're not going to be the complete, performer that we're looking for here. And, he had people close to him who shared his political goals, who doubted him. In prison, he did things like he learned the language of the oppressor, Afrikaans. He studied, he read books on Afrikaner history. And his fellow political prisoners said, "What the hell are you doing? You're going soft." And he said, No, you leave me alone. I have my plan. And of course, he was preparing the way. He's getting to know his enemy, the better to combat him on the field of negotiations when the time came. And then also when he was out of prison and, before democracy, there were people who wondered, why are you reaching out and trying to make peace and dialogue with these extreme right, vile Afrikaners who all they want to do is destroy us? And again, he'd say, quiet, I've got my plan. Let me just get on with this. And, that self-confidence, the self-knowledge, the resilience, they're all there, piled in together.
The point that you just raised reminded me that he himself saw himself as a bridge builder, and building bridges between himself and his community and people that were unlikely candidates on the other side of the bridge. I don't know where he got that vision from, but as he said himself, it always seems impossible until it's done. And I
think the concept of Ubuntu has to include everybody, even those with whom you have, major political differences. I think one thing that Mandela understood very well, and it came across in things that he said and things that he did, was he understood that it is, after all, circumstances of life over which you don't have too much control that determine what kind of political allegiances you have. So
Yes.
Mandela was born a black man in South Africa, and then the apartheid system came along. But Mandela understood that he'd been born a white man, an Afrikaner, on a farm in the northern Transvaal. Then it was pretty damn difficult that he wasn't going to be, a racist and everything else. And he understood that there was that element of circumstances in life that leads people down one path or another. But what he also understood is that below those circumstances, there is some element of goodness and some desire to reach out and some element of Ubuntu in everybody. And so he did that. So he would talk and dialogue with people who were on the surface, his bitterest enemies, not just on the surface, but he dug, he sort of went into their hearts and started digging until he found that common humanity, the Ubuntu factor. And then he built the bridge.
That's wonderful. He, as an example of his resilience, I quoted the other day from his book, The Long Walk to Freedom, where he said, "I have walked that long road to freedom. I've tried not to falter, but I've made missteps along the way. I've discovered the secret, however, that after climbing a great hill, one only finds that there are many more hills to climb. Mm-hmm. Now I've taken a moment here to rest, to steal a view of the glorious vista that surrounds me, to look back on the distance I've come. But I can rest only for a moment, for with freedom comes responsibilities, and I dare not linger, for my long walk is not yet ended." So, that force, that was the basis of his resilience, has propelled him through all the obstacles and the hills and the valleys that he had gone through. Thank you, John. Can we move on to the next one, which is a pillar? It's called empathy. And there may be various ways of understanding empathy. And I'd like you maybe to tell us if you can recall an incident where Mandela really showed his heart. Because my own understanding of empathy is the ability to feel with others, not for others, but really feel with others, to share their dilemmas, and not only being driven by head and hands, but by your heart.
Well, I mean, for me, empathy means an ability to put yourself in the other person's shoes, to be able to feel, to imagine, and to feel, and to have a real sense of what the person that you're talking to is all about, what makes them tick. I was present at Mandela's first press conference on the day after his release, and I asked him a question. I said, "What's going to be, you're now planning on embarking on negotiations," which at that time seemed a very, very implausible prospect. There didn't seem to be any notion that the white government was going to voluntarily, be persuaded to relinquish power. And so I asked him in the press conference, "What's going to be the plan?" And his answer was, "We have to reconcile black aspirations with white fears." So already, in a big picture way, he understood that the real essence of, or the motor behind the apartheid system, and the reason why he was feared at that time, just after his release by white people, it was about fear. That was the essential feeling, was fear that what's going to happen to us now. So in that sense, he was able to put himself in the shoes of white people right from the beginning. And so he went out of his way, always really, but even from the beginning, to show, to sort of stage, almost in a theatrical kind of way, that he was not someone who white people should fear, but actually someone who wanted to be white people's friends. And that on the day when he became president, he was going to be an equal opportunity president, in the sense that he was going to care not just for black South Africans, he was going to be a president for all South Africans and try and do, work for the common good. Now, that might mean, doing a little bit of displacing of privilege and everything, but nevertheless. And so, so for example, I'm talking about immediately after his release, I'm talking about his first press conference, which is the most amazing press conference out of hundreds that I've been to in my life. And what happened during that press conference, in which there were about 200 journalists from all over the world, was that those of us who asked questions, and only about 10 people asked questions, had to identify themselves by their name and by their medium. So I was there representing the Independent of London, and someone from the BBC asked someone from CBS America. And then this guy lifts up his hand and says he works for Die Burger, which, as you know, is an Afrikaner and at the time deeply conservative newspaper that thought it was a really bad idea to have let Mandela out of prison. And so this guy, with a certain courage, it must be said, identified himself as the political editor of Die Burger and asked a question. And Mandela, when the guy identifies himself, before Mandela answers, there's a kind of sharp intake of breath. Oh my God, Mandela's just come out of prison. How's he going to respond to this guy who is the very incarnation of the enemy? And Mandela's response is to break out into a big smile and say, I can't remember the guy's name. Let's say it was Heldenhuis. Mr. Heldenhuis, what an immense pleasure to meet you in the flesh. I've been reading you with great interest for many years now. See? So right there, this goes beyond an interaction between him and this guy Heldenhuis. It's a way of conveying a message through that press conference, which the whole country's watching, that, he doesn't have horns. He's not going to go and, draw blood and bite. He's actually a human being with a sense of humor, and who has is already trying to, relax things and make things easy with that journalist and through that journalist to white South Africans as a whole. And that anecdote, I can spend the whole night here giving you anecdotes of that kind. But even after he achieved his goal and after he became president, he continually made these kind of gestures, kind of theatrical gestures. He was aware of the power of symbolism towards white people in particular, but also towards his own black enemies, such as Mangosuthu Buthelezi, who was actually just as much of a danger for him at the end as anyone in the white establishment. And he also reached out to Mangosuthu Buthelezi and other people, within the black community that were his political rivals. And so, and he understood where they were coming from. He understood their fears. He understood, as I was saying a minute ago, that it's also circumstances of life that lead you down a particular political path. And so he tried to go beyond that to the human being within. Again, empathy, Mandela had bucket loads of it.
Yeah, so at the end, I want to ask you a question related to that. And that is whether you think some of us can emulate that. But let's move on quickly to the last pillar, which is the pillar of service. And so I'll ask you a question. Do you think Mandela fitted the description of a servant leader, one that serves? And if so, why do you believe that?
Well, completely. And again, I'll repeat what I've said before, that it's very difficult to put any of these 5 pillars in isolation, because one feeds off the other. They all just nourish each other. And, if the 5 pillars aren't there, then if there's just 4, they're liable to fall down.
Yes.
And so the sense of service, well, that just comes back to what I was saying before. He had a choice. He was, among black South Africans, it sounds a weird thing to say, but he was nevertheless, he belonged to a privileged few. And he decided that rather than serve himself as a lawyer and make a decent living for himself, he was going to make it his life's business to serve his people. And in choosing to do that, he made the most difficult decision of his life, which is to serve the national family over his own biological family. His wife, his kids, they were going to suffer as a consequence of the huge choice that he made to serve the nation as a whole, the great faceless nation, without faces and names. His family had faces and names. And by the choice that he made, he was condemning not just himself, but his family to a life of great difficulty, as was shown to be the case after he left prison, because Winnie and the children suffered a lot. And so, the notion of service, of public service, is absolutely fundamental to an understanding of Mandela. He said it in his speeches, "I, the servant of the people." He said that when he became president. He was the absolute polar opposite of that classic corrupt leader who's just there in it for himself, who's there to boost his ego, who's a narcissist. He is, if you like, I can't imagine any political leader who is more the polar opposite of Donald Trump than Nelson Mandela. Nelson Mandela wasn't there, to boost his own ego. He was there chiefly as the servant of the people.
Yes, and you've seen that. Would you agree with me that to be a servant truly and to be a leader seems to be a paradoxical statement? It's a paradox that Mandela lived out, because when I block out the leader part of who he was, I can see him as a servant. And when I block out that other part, I see him as a leader. And yet, when I stand back, I see a perfect blend, a fusion of service and leadership in Nelson Mandela. And I do think that he uniquely showed that it is not possible to serve people unless you care for them. Because I think there is an enduring suspicion that politicians, as powerful as they may be, or as intelligent as they may be, there's an enduring suspicion that the values that they espouse and mouth are not really coming from their heart. Mandela actually could speak to a range of people. On one hand, speak to world leaders, and the other hand, hug a person in the street, equally genuinely.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah. I think that, again, we come back to this word I used before, integrity. These doubts that people may have about politicians, as you say, whether they're mouthing stuff and not really, having their heart behind it. Mandela proved the substance and the integrity of what he said to me, and that's where I had the privilege of knowing him, that I could see him in the private sphere, behave in a manner that was absolutely congruent with the message, fundamentally the message of respect that he preached. It's a message of respect from everything else that flows. But I like the point that you make, John, about this riddle or this paradox between servant and leader. I mean, it's an interesting one, and we can get into a whole sort of, philosophical tangle if we go down that road too much. But I mean, it's true, because I mean, as a leader, you have to have that self-confidence. You have to have that certainty that, the path that you want to lead your people down is the correct path. And there, the people are going to follow you. So in a way, the people there are your servants. But at the same time, you're doing that out of an absolute conviction that it is what you're doing, what you're proposing is absolutely in the best interest of the people, and therefore you are serving them too. But it's an interesting little sort of riddle there that you've raised.
Yeah, John, as we close, and I wish we could go on forever, because you had such a wealth of understanding and experience, not only about Nelson Mandela, but about world leadership. But I was sitting in the US when Mandela walked out of prison, and I was filled with anger and a deep determination. I never want to go back to South Africa. And when I saw Nelson Mandela walk out of prison, and I heard him say things that he said when he went in, that South Africa belongs to all the people, that I saw a distinct absence of malice and of revenge. I saw Ubuntu. I decided to come back to South Africa, and I did come back at the end of 1990. But I still, until today, wondered. The aspiration that I had is I want to, somebody wrote the book, Leading Like Mandela. Well, be in some way like Mandela. And the question I wanted to ask you as we approach Mandela Day, which, as I said at the beginning, is premised on the belief that we can also do things that Mandela did. But do you really honestly believe that he is a once-off human being, and that, or do you really believe that we can emulate him in a way that maybe you can help us understand? Because I know I can not be Nelson Mandela. But I know that I have a story, and I have to own my own story with all its own brokenness and its own commitments. But I never would like to compare myself with Mandela. And although he inspired me to be like him, I wondered if that's possible. Will we ever see another Nelson Mandela?
Well, ever is a long time, John. So I don't know about ever. But I think that, he's the measure. He's the measure of the great leader. He is, certainly in my experience, and I've been around, I haven't just been in South Africa. I've been to a lot of countries, and I've written about a lot of places and lots of conflicts, and I've never seen anyone remotely of his stature. And I think that, I do think he is or was in a class of his own. I talked before about, music and football, Lionel Messi, football, Mozart, music. I mean, that's Mandela with politics. But at the same time, I think that there is a nobility and a value in seeking to emulate him, to try and follow his basic, these 5 pillars that we mentioned here, kind of glued together perhaps by that word that I mentioned, the word integrity, and also by the word respect. I think those are 2 terribly important words when you think about Mandela too. You see, one thing that made me particularly attached to South Africa, which is a country to which I will always feel most attached, even though I have no family connections there, or, I only went there when I was about, 36 or something like that. I knew nothing about South Africa. But the thing is that I found, and I think this is the key point, and I've said this before to friends, I found so many mini Mandelas in South Africa. I mean, that was the beauty of it, that there were just so many extraordinarily fine people who had really the essential Mandela qualities of integrity, respect, generosity. I met them all the time. People who've never, ever made it into a newspaper, and certainly not, very far from becoming world famous or even famous in South Africa. But I'd go to a little township in the Orange Free State, or I'd go to some, I don't know, not just even that, maybe a farm, an Afrikaner. And I'd find, those qualities there, that kindness, that generosity, that sense of service, the empathy, the resilience, the self-knowledge, the self-confidence, the sense of service. I saw that in people. Now, the thing is, Mandela had a special talent. I mean, and I think, we have to accept that, as in all spheres, football, music, painting, whatever, there are people who just have some God-given gift that other people don't have. And Mandela just combined everything. And he had that enormous charisma, that vast self-confidence, to a degree which is very difficult to find in ordinary people, that vast self-confidence and that immense charm, which also goes hand in hand with self-confidence and charisma. He kind of had it all. We mentioned the 5 pillars. He had 10 out of 10. He had 100% in each one. Now, most of us can only, hope to get, 60% in one, 70% in the other, but at least you try. And I think by trying to emulate what he did and his values and his talents, if more people did that in the world would certainly be a far better place than it is right now.
Indeed. He certainly surprised me many times. In particular, in your book about playing the enemy. You know, when I remember in 1995, I saw him on the rugby field, and I wondered, what is he trying to accomplish? And then I realized that you used the word hope, and that we all hope for a better world and a better South Africa. But hope is not a strategy. You have to develop a strategy. Hope is not one of them. And maybe the 5 pillars is a place to start building a strategy. And you've helped me certainly understand that in a deeper way, John. What a privilege to have you and have this conversation with you. I want to thank you from the bottom of my heart.
It's an absolute pleasure, John. It's wonderful to be with you.
Thank you. All the best.